Every night, just before falling asleep, a little boy named Elian would look through his bedroom window and wonder why a strange golden light sometimes appeared beyond the old forest, even though there was no house, no road, and no one who had ever lived there. Elian had asked his parents about the mysterious light many times, but they always smiled and told him that it was probably only moonlight shining through the trees. So eventually he stopped asking and began keeping the secret quietly inside his heart. But one quiet night, when the entire village had fallen asleep and even the crickets seemed to have stopped singing, Elian opened his eyes and saw something impossible through his window. The golden light was no longer hidden among the trees, because a small house stood beneath it. The house looked small and peaceful, with a crooked chimney, round windows glowing like little stars, and a wooden door painted deep blue. But what frightened Elian most was not the strange house itself. It was the tiny figure standing quietly beside its door, as if waiting for someone. Elian rubbed his sleepy eyes and looked again, but the little figure was still there, and when he blinked for the third time, the figure slowly raised one hand toward him, as though it somehow knew exactly where his bedroom window was. For a moment Elian wanted to hide beneath his blanket, but a strange feeling in his heart told him that the little figure was not trying to frighten him, and before he could change his mind, he quietly put on his slippers, opened his bedroom door, and stepped into the sleeping house. The village was completely silent as Elian walked toward the forest, and although every step made him wonder whether he should turn back, the golden house remained visible between the trees like a small lantern waiting patiently at the end of a forgotten path. When Elian finally reached the house, he discovered that it was much larger inside than it had appeared from the village, with a warm wooden floor, shelves filled with glowing glass jars, hundreds of tiny clocks ticking softly, and walls covered with drawings of sleeping children from places he had never seen. Elian slowly walked closer to one of the drawings and realized that the child in it looked strangely familiar, wearing the same blue pajamas he had worn earlier that night. And beneath the picture someone had written a single sentence that made his heart beat faster. Just as Elian leaned closer to read the mysterious sentence, all the tiny clocks in the room suddenly stopped ticking at exactly the same moment, and from somewhere behind the blue door came a gentle voice that whispered, "You finally came, Elian. We have been waiting for you." The blue door opened slowly without anyone touching it, revealing a narrow hallway filled with soft golden light. And although Elian could hear the gentle voice calling him from somewhere beyond the darkness, he took a deep breath and stepped through the doorway. At the end of the hallway stood the tiny figure Elian had seen outside, and now that they were closer, he could see that it was a little girl with silver hair, a pale blue dress, and a tiny lantern in her hands that glowed like a captured piece of moonlight. The little girl smiled and introduced herself as Mira, the keeper of the house, before explaining that the house appeared only when every person in the village was asleep, because it was built to protect something that could only survive during the quietest hours of the night. Elian looked around the strange room and finally asked what the house was protecting, and Mira's smile disappeared for a moment as she pointed toward a small glass jar sitting alone on a wooden table, where a tiny golden light was quietly floating inside. Mira told him that the little golden light was called a dream seed, a rare piece of wonder created whenever a child somewhere in the world fell asleep while believing that tomorrow could still be better than today. Elian stared at the tiny light in silence because he suddenly understood why the house had always appeared to him from the forest. And when he asked Mira why she had brought him there, she quietly answered that the dream seed had chosen him. Before Elian could ask another question, the tiny golden light suddenly became brighter and projected a soft image into the air, showing a lonely little girl sitting beside a window somewhere far away, quietly wishing that someone would come and remind her that she was not alone. Elian felt a quiet sadness in his chest as he watched the lonely girl, and although he had never met her, he knew exactly what it felt like to wonder whether anyone in the world truly understood the thoughts that kept you awake at night. Mira gently placed her lantern on the table and told Elian that the house could not simply send the dream seed to the lonely girl, because only someone who truly understood her sadness could carry its light through the world of dreams. Elian looked at the glowing dream seed one more time, then looked at Mira with a quiet determination that even surprised himself, and said that if the little girl was waiting for someone to remind her that she was not alone, he would try to be that someone. Mira carefully lifted the glass jar from the table and held it between both hands. Then she told Elian to close his eyes and imagine the one place where he always felt completely safe, because the dream seed could only open the door to the dream world when someone carried a peaceful thought inside their heart. Elian thought about his bedroom, the soft blanket on his bed, the sound of rain against the window, and the comforting feeling of knowing that his parents were sleeping safely nearby. And as those peaceful thoughts filled his mind, the dream seed began glowing brighter than ever before. A gentle breeze suddenly moved through the room, even though every window was closed. The glowing jars on the shelves began floating quietly in the air, and beneath Elian's feet the wooden floor transformed into a soft silver mist that slowly carried him toward a doorway made entirely of moonlight. Mira reached out and held Elian's hand before they stepped together through the moonlit doorway, and the moment they crossed it, the magical house disappeared behind them, leaving only a vast, quiet sky filled with enormous silver clouds and thousands of stars shining beneath their feet. Elian looked down and discovered that the stars beneath him were not really stars at all, but tiny glowing memories belonging to sleeping children around the world, each one floating gently through the dream sky like a little lantern carrying a happy moment. Mira explained that every child carried memories into their dreams, but somewhere beyond the silver clouds was a forgotten place where the memories of lonely children became faint and almost invisible, and that was where they needed to find the girl from the dream seed. They walked across a wide silver cloud until the bright dream sky slowly became quieter and darker, and soon the happy glowing memories around them became fewer, while distant lights appeared one by one like tiny windows belonging to children who were dreaming alone. Then Elian noticed one tiny window glowing much more faintly than the others, and although it was almost impossible to see through the darkness, something inside his heart told him that the lonely girl they were searching for was waiting behind it. As they moved closer to the faint window, Elian began hearing a soft humming sound carried by the dream wind, and the melody was so quiet and lonely that he could almost feel the girl's sadness before he had even seen her face. Finally, the silver clouds opened before them and revealed a small dream bedroom beneath a quiet moon, where the lonely girl sat beside her window with her arms around her knees, unaware that two visitors had crossed an entire world of dreams just to find her. Elian slowly stepped closer to the girl and spoke in the gentlest voice he could, telling her that he had traveled through a strange house and an endless world of dreams just to find her. And the girl slowly lifted her head, as though she could hardly believe that someone had truly come. The girl introduced herself as Leora and admitted that she had been waiting for a long time, because every night she dreamed that someone might visit her. But each time morning came, the dream disappeared, and she was left wondering whether anyone had ever heard her quiet wishes. Elian told Leora that her wishes had not disappeared at all, because one of them had become a tiny golden dream seed that had traveled all the way to the mysterious house. And the moment she heard this, a small smile appeared on her face for the first time in what felt like a very long while. Mira carefully opened her hands and released the dream seed into the air, where it floated toward Leora like a tiny golden firefly. And when it touched her chest, the entire room became warmer and brighter, as countless forgotten happy memories slowly returned around her. Leora suddenly remembered the sound of her mother's laughter, the afternoon she had learned to ride a bicycle, the warm blanket her father used to place around her shoulders, and all the little moments she had once believed were gone forever. Leora began to cry, but these were not the lonely tears she had cried before. They were tears of relief, because she finally understood that being alone for a while did not mean that she had been forgotten by everyone she loved. Elian smiled and told Leora that sometimes people could be far away, busy, or unable to say what was inside their hearts, but that did not mean their love had disappeared. And Leora listened carefully, as though those simple words were exactly what she had been waiting to hear. As Leora's heart became lighter, the tiny dream bedroom slowly transformed, the dark walls turning into a beautiful night sky filled with soft stars, while the window opened onto a peaceful garden where flowers glowed gently beneath the moon. Leora looked at the garden with wonder, and then asked Elian whether he would come back another night. But before he could answer, Mira gently reminded them that the dream world could not remain open forever, and that the first light of morning was already beginning to appear beyond the clouds. Elian took Leora's hand and promised that she should never again believe that she was forgotten, because somewhere in the world there would always be someone willing to listen. And with those words the three children watched as the first golden light of morning slowly touched the dream garden. The golden morning light spread across the dream garden, and just as Elian thought it was time to return home, the dream seed suddenly floated away from Leora and began shining with a strange silver glow, as though it had discovered another distant child whose dream was quietly calling for help. Mira looked worried for the first time and explained that dream seeds normally return to the house after helping one child, but this one was behaving differently, which could only mean that another forgotten dream somewhere in the world was in danger of disappearing completely. Leora gently stepped forward and told Elian that she was no longer afraid of being alone. So if another child was waiting somewhere in the darkness, perhaps the dream seed should be allowed to help that child too. Mira smiled because Leora had finally understood the secret of the dream seeds. They were never meant to belong to one person, but were meant to travel from one hopeful heart to another whenever someone needed a small reminder that tomorrow was still worth waiting for. Before Elian could say goodbye to Leora, the garden began dissolving into thousands of tiny silver particles, and Mira quickly told him that they had only a few moments left before the dream world closed, so he had to decide whether to return home with them or follow the dream seed toward its next mysterious destination. Elian looked at Leora and realized that she no longer needed him to stay, because the lonely sadness that had once surrounded her had been replaced by something much stronger, a quiet belief that she could carry hope with her even after the dream disappeared. Leora reached out and hugged Elian tightly, thanking him for crossing the impossible distance between their dreams, and when she finally stepped back, a tiny golden spark remained in her hands, glowing softly like a promise that she would never forget the night someone came looking for her. Elian turned toward Mira and followed the silver dream seed as it drifted across the fading dream sky. But just before he left, he looked back one last time and saw Leora standing beneath the glowing flowers, waving at him with a smile that was completely different from the lonely expression he had seen when they first arrived. The moment Elian and Mira touched the silver dream seed, the entire dream sky folded around them like a giant curtain, and when it opened again, they found themselves standing on a strange floating path surrounded by enormous clocks whose hands were all pointing toward different moments in time. Elian stared at the enormous clocks in confusion until Mira quietly explained that they had entered the deepest part of the dream world, a place where forgotten wishes did not disappear but waited patiently for someone brave enough to find them. And somewhere beyond the clocks was a secret that could finally explain why the mysterious house had chosen Elian. Elian and Mira followed the silver dream seed along the floating path, passing enormous clocks that seemed to contain tiny scenes from forgotten dreams, until they reached the oldest clock of them all, whose glass face was covered in delicate cracks and whose hands had stopped at exactly midnight. Mira stopped in front of the ancient clock and whispered that she had seen it many times before, but she had never been able to open it because the clock was not waiting for a key or a magical spell. It was waiting for someone who could remember the very first dream they had ever forgotten. Elian closed his eyes and tried to remember his earliest dream, but at first he could only see darkness, until a tiny sound of laughter appeared somewhere in his memory and slowly became a picture of himself as a much younger child standing beneath a huge tree while someone held his hand. As the memory became clearer, Elian remembered that the person holding his hand had once told him that every night was a doorway, and that somewhere beyond every sleeping child's dream there was always a little light waiting to remind them that they were loved. A single tear rolled down Elian's cheek as he opened his eyes, because he suddenly realized that the mysterious voice from his childhood memory was the same gentle voice he had heard behind the blue door on the night the magical house first appeared. Mira looked at Elian in astonishment and asked him whether he understood what this meant. And Elian slowly nodded because he finally knew that the house had not chosen him by accident. The house had been watching over him since the very first dream he had ever forgotten. Suddenly the ancient clock began ticking again, one slow heartbeat at a time, and every enormous clock around them followed until the entire dream world filled with a deep, gentle rhythm that sounded almost like thousands of sleeping hearts beating together. Behind the ancient clock, a hidden doorway slowly appeared, and unlike the blue door of the magical house, this one was made of warm wooden branches covered in tiny, glowing stars, while a familiar golden light shone through its opening. Elian stepped toward the branch-covered doorway, and immediately recognized the golden glow beyond it, because it was exactly the same light he had watched from his bedroom window on countless nights. the light that had always seemed to be quietly waiting for him in the forest. Mira gently took Elian's hand, and together they stepped through the glowing doorway, only to discover something neither of them had expected. On the other side stood the magical house itself, but this time it was not deep inside the forest. It was standing beside the enormous tree from Elian's forgotten childhood memory. Elian stood beneath the enormous tree and slowly looked up through its familiar branches, remembering how small he had once been when he dreamed beneath it, while the magical house beside him seemed almost like an old friend that had finally returned after waiting patiently for him to remember. Mira walked around the tree and pointed toward a small wooden bench hidden among its roots, explaining that this was where the first keeper of the house had once sat every night, watching over sleeping children and collecting the tiny hopes that floated from their dreams. Elian touched the old bench with his fingertips, and instantly another memory appeared around him, showing the same loving adult from his childhood sitting beside him beneath the tree and gently explaining that one day, when Elian was old enough to understand, the house would call him back. Elian turned toward Mira with wide eyes and asked who the mysterious adult had been, but Mira only looked toward the glowing windows of the house and said that some answers were not meant to be told by someone else, because Elian would have to discover the truth for himself. The deep blue door of the magical house suddenly opened by itself, and from inside came the soft sound of a familiar lullaby that Elian remembered hearing when he was very young, making him realize that the house had been carrying pieces of his childhood all along. Inside the house, Elian discovered a long wooden staircase leading upward, with each step carrying a tiny glowing symbol from a different moment in his life, and as he climbed he saw memories he had forgotten slowly appearing around him like stars. One memory showed Elian laughing beneath the old tree. Another showed him crying after losing his favorite toy, and another showed him quietly making a wish before falling asleep. And he began to understand that the house had never only protected dreams, it had also protected the feelings children were sometimes too young to understand. At the top of the staircase, Elian found a small circular room filled with hundreds of sleeping stars, and in the center stood a wooden chair beside a large window, where the mysterious adult from his memories seemed to have sat many years ago. On the wooden chair lay a small blue notebook covered in dust, and when Elian opened it, he found page after page filled with drawings of children, dreams, and tiny golden lights, until he reached the final page where a drawing of himself appeared beneath the words, "The next keeper will remember when he is ready." Elian slowly closed the notebook and looked at Mira, finally understanding why the house had chosen him. But before either of them could speak, one of the sleeping stars above them suddenly opened like a tiny eye and whispered a single message that made the entire room fall silent. The tiny star looked directly at Elian and whispered that the house was not calling him to become its keeper yet, but to prepare him for a night when the dream seeds would suddenly stop appearing and every sleeping child in the world would have to find another way to remember how to hope. Elian asked what would happen if the dream seeds disappeared, and the tiny star answered that dreams would slowly become empty. Children would wake without remembering the beautiful things they had imagined, and eventually the magical house itself would begin fading from the world. Mira suddenly opened the blue notebook again and discovered a final hidden drawing beneath the last page, showing the ancient tree surrounded by hundreds of children holding tiny lights in their hands, with Elian standing at the center as if he were meant to remind them that hope becomes stronger whenever it is shared. Elian stared at the drawing for a long moment before realizing that the children in it were not strangers at all, because each glowing light represented a child whose dream he had already helped, including Leora, and there were still hundreds of lights that remained completely dark. Mira gently told Elian that he did not have to save every child in the world, because no one person could carry that much hope alone, but he could teach others how to share their own small lights until the darkness was no longer stronger than them. Elian placed his hand over the glowing page and quietly promised that if the house truly needed him, he would help teach children to protect the little lights inside their hearts, not by making their sadness disappear, but by reminding them that sadness could exist beside hope. The moment Elian finished his promise, every sleeping star in the room began glowing again, first as tiny points of light, and then as hundreds of brilliant stars, until the entire circular room looked like a peaceful night sky filled with new possibilities. The ancient house began trembling softly beneath them, not from fear, but from joy, and the wooden walls filled with warm golden light, as if the house itself had heard Elian's promise and finally recognized the person who had been quietly growing into its next guardian. Mira looked at Elian with a quiet smile and told him that becoming the keeper of the house did not mean he had to live there forever, because the most important part of being a dream keeper was returning to the real world and carrying its light into ordinary days. Elian looked through the new golden doorway and saw his own bedroom waiting quietly on the other side, with the first morning light touching his window, and for the first time he understood that the greatest magic of the mysterious house was not keeping children asleep, it was helping them wake up with something worth believing in. Elian stepped through the golden doorway and found himself standing beside his own bed, while the magical house, Mira, and the endless dream world remained visible behind him for only a few precious seconds before the doorway began slowly shrinking into a tiny point of golden light. Elian reached toward the fading doorway, wanting to say goodbye to Mira, but before he could speak, she smiled and placed one hand over her heart, silently reminding him that people who truly mattered did not always need to stay beside you for you to carry them with you. The doorway disappeared completely, leaving only one tiny golden spark floating above Elian's bed, and when he gently touched it, the spark became warm against his fingertip before dissolving into his hand like a quiet promise that the house would find him again whenever the world needed another dream keeper. Elian quietly climbed back into bed and pulled his blanket around himself, but instead of falling asleep immediately, he looked toward the forest through his window and wondered whether the mysterious house was still there, waiting somewhere beyond the trees. For several moments everything looked completely ordinary, but just as Elian began to close his eyes, he noticed something hanging from the branch of the old tree outside, a tiny blue lantern that looked exactly like the one Mira had carried through the world of dreams. Elian smiled because he understood that Mira had left the lantern behind as a reminder, and although he could not explain everything that had happened during the night, he knew that some adventures were not meant to be explained. They were meant to quietly change the person who experienced them. A few minutes later, Elian finally closed his eyes, and for the first time in many years he fell asleep without wondering whether his dreams would be there when he woke, because somewhere deep inside his heart he now understood that dreams could disappear from memory without ever truly disappearing from the world. Far beyond the sleeping village, where the ancient forest became deeper and quieter, the mysterious house stood beneath the enormous tree once again, its round windows glowing warmly as hundreds of tiny golden lights slowly appeared inside, each one carrying a new dream waiting for the night. Inside the highest room of the house, the old blue notebook slowly opened by itself, and beneath the drawing of Elian, a new golden line appeared, quietly recording the first night of his journey as the newest guardian of the little lights that lived inside children's dreams. And while the village slowly awakened beneath the morning sun, the mysterious house quietly waited for another night, because somewhere in the waking world another child would soon close their eyes. Another dream would begin, and another tiny light would need someone to remind it how to shine. That evening, when the sun disappeared behind the hills and the village slowly became quiet again, Elian looked toward the ancient forest from his bedroom window and noticed that the tiny blue lantern was glowing once more, gently illuminating the path beneath the old tree. Elian smiled, but did not leave his room this time, because he finally understood that becoming a guardian did not mean chasing every mystery, and sometimes the most important thing he could do was simply allow someone else's dream to find its own way. He closed his curtains, climbed beneath his blanket, and placed one hand over his heart, remembering Leora, Mira, the magical house, and every little light he had seen, until his room became quiet enough for him to hear his own breathing. As Elian drifted toward sleep, he heard a familiar gentle voice whisper from somewhere beyond his dreams, not asking him to come anywhere or solve anything, but simply telling him that every small act of kindness could become a light for someone who was quietly lost. In his dream, Elian found himself standing beneath the enormous ancient tree once again, but this time hundreds of children were gathered around him, each holding a tiny glowing light, and among them he saw Leora smiling, while Mira stood quietly beside the magical house. No one spoke because they did not need to, and one by one the children lifted their little lights toward the sky, until hundreds of tiny lights joined together above the ancient tree and became a beautiful new constellation, shining gently over the sleeping world. Elian looked at the constellation and finally understood the secret the house had been trying to teach him all along. A dream does not become weaker when it is shared with someone else, because hope grows brighter every time one person gives a little of their light to another. When Elian opened his eyes again, morning had arrived, but the memory of the dream remained clear inside his heart, and beside his pillow he found one tiny golden star that glowed softly for a moment, before becoming an ordinary little piece of sunlight. Elian never told anyone about the house, the dream world, or the children he had met, but from that morning onward, whenever he noticed someone sitting alone, feeling sad or quietly losing hope, he would sit beside them and offer the smallest kindness he could, just enough to remind them that they were not alone. And from that night on, whenever every light in the village went out and every child finally closed their eyes, a little golden house would appear quietly beneath the ancient tree, waiting among the stars, because somewhere in the sleeping world a new dream was beginning, and there would always be a little light waiting to remind someone that tomorrow could still be beautiful.